Bar for bar album reviews. Earl Sweatshirt, Sick. Sick is the latest album from Earl Sweatshirt and follows Feet of Clay and some rap songs, which dropped about 3 or so years ago. And this album may feel like a bit of a departure from the traditional sound that we expect from Earl, especially with some rap songs and Feet of Clay, where the production was a bit more in your face, and Earl was mixed right within the production and wasn't really at the forefront like he is with this project. This project, on the other hand, he's much clearer and easier to hear, at least on first listen, which is always a good thing, but you can't really discount that some rap songs in Feet of Clay were really good albums as well. But focusing on this album, a lot of people have said that it's a bit more upbeat, and Earl isn't as in a depressive state as he was on his previous works, which may be the case. And I mean, it's entirely possible. We don't know Earl that well. We're not close friends with Earl, but I think a lot of it has to do with the production. The production here it's different. It's not as, abrasive, and feels like it leans more towards the sampling sort of sound, which I always enjoy. But while it's sampling, it's also not sampling to the extent where you can just easily recognize where it's coming from. These are just samples I've never heard of, and that's always fun. Now, moving on with this album, it's definitely a product of quarantine and the pandemic and COVID in general. Especially because Earl himself said that it kind of is. I believe he said that he was writing an album prior to the pandemic around 2019 or so. And once everything started popping off, he essentially scrapped it and basically became a fly on the wall, where he's observing how people are, dealing with the pandemic and lockdowns, and beyond that, everything that happened in 2020, with all the Black Lives Matter protests and the murders of black people for no good reason. So he has a lot to really pull from, and it's very obvious throughout the album if you kind of pay attention to certain things. The main thing really is, though, that people going kind of stir crazy. They're stuck in the house. They can't really go nowhere. So that's the main thing that you hear him bring up. On the intro track, Old Friend, one of the starting lines is, strong spirit where the body couldn't get asylum, the cost of living high, don't cross the picket line and get the virus. Wildcat has got him in a bind, stay inside. I came from out the thicket smiling. So, you have the cost of living being high. Rent is very high. And during the pandemic, especially the early days of pandemic, people lost their jobs. A lot of people lost their jobs. So, they had to do rent forgiveness and the such, basically so that, people could live and not lose their homes. Then he says, don't cross the picket line and get the virus. The virus is literally COVID, but also don't cross this picket line, which to me symbolizes the protests that were happening throughout the pandemic. That was always a concern too. If you are out there protesting, are you going to get sick? But also, the virus could be something else entirely. If he's speaking to the people against the protesters, why would you not want them to cross the picket line and join your force and catch that virus? But I think there's more to it than that. And then, stay inside. I came from out the thicket smiling. To Earl, it sounds like this is kind of a regular thing. It's nothing new to him. He seems to be okay with going in or staying inside because, I don't like shit. I don't go outside. So he's back outside smiling, and while everyone else is just kind of stressed the fuck out. Then with the track Sick, continue on this whole pandemic and virus and sickness, he goes and says, can't go out, sad, can't go outside because dude's is sick. Like, yeah, like you don't want to go outside because you don't want to catch the Rona. So it makes sense. And it's important to note too that at the end of this track, he has an outro from Fela Kuti. And it's important to bring up here because he talks about art and music in Africa and African culture and how, that can be a way to, promote the culture. And that's something I'll get into in just a moment. But Vision, the following track after Sick, carries on very similar themes to the whole virus and kind of the lockdown. The line here, singular current event, everything we in the midst of, how long you waiving the rent, moratorium extendo, I'm just evading the pit, ain't no parade in the tent. So there's a singular current event that we're all dealing with, the virus, like everything, and then there's all this stuff that we're in the midst of. Like, how long are you going to continue to waive the rent? Because we kind of need it. And then, he doesn't want to have to live on the streets, like in a tent. And then, before I get into the next thing I was going to say, this track is dope. And having Z Loopers was just great. And I especially liked the whole semi-hook thing that he did with the Desert Eagle line. That was great. But going on to the end of this track, we get another outro, which is very important because it furthers the Black empowerment. And given everything that happened in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests and the murders of Black people, like it's appropriate and very important to bring up. Like, there's definitely a lot of people who just kind of, after everything calmed down, they're like, yeah, we don't want to talk about it no more. But it's still, like, things may have changed, but not significantly. So it's definitely something that you need to bring up and talk about still. So having both those outros definitely helped to, I guess, push that issue home. I would hope so. Keeping with the whole theme and idea of Black empowerment, the track Lye goes a little bit into history. So lye is a chemical that has been traditionally used to straighten hair, and in general has been a painful experience. So what's important with this here is that back in the day, and even to an extent now, the purpose of straightening your hair, beyond you just wanting to do it, because you can totally do it if you want to, like, by all means. But it used to be kind of a way to, I guess, conform and look more presentable to certain people. So him bringing that up here also kind of pushes the whole idea of Black empowerment, because we are now getting to the point where, a lot of prominent figures, like I see it on Twitter all the time. They're like, oh, I'm finally wearing my natural hair. And I'm like, that's amazing. That's dope. And it's just strange to think about, like, it's been so long since, I guess, lye specifically has been used, or at least as widespread, or whatever. Like, it's not used as commonly, but people still feel like they have to straighten their hair to kind of fit in and get opportunities, essentially. Another theme that is mentioned throughout this album, but I feel like it's kind of loosely referenced, is this idea of looking back and reflecting on the past. Obviously, we get that with the track 2010, which is, essentially just a track talking about Earl back in the day, how he would drive his mom crazy, and this was like around 2010, presumably. But then on the track Titanic, we have him reference came back in 2011. So, there's a few moments where he just kind of touches on it, but doesn't really delve into it too much. But there are tracks where he does. On God Laughs, he talks about his grandfather and how he knew 13 languages. And then presumably, like, he, talks about him in his, like, the late stages of his life and when he passed away. Then on Fire in the Hole, which is the outro song, like, the whole thing just sounds like a reflection. And it gets to the point where he mentions it's no rewinding for the umpteenth time, it's only forward. So it's like, yeah, you have to look back, but also just keep pushing. Like, don't live in the past. Like, you have to move forward with it. So it's a little bit like he wants to acknowledge it, and in the same time just be like, nah, like that's in the past. So you could even go further and be like, oh, well, this newish sort of sound that he has where it's less abrasive and you hear him more clearly could be the change going forward. And he's not necessarily going to go back to that old sound. I don't know. That's probably a stretch, but you could think that. But overall, this album was enjoyable. And Earl is one of those guys that doesn't really connect or click with people right away. So with this album, I went in expecting to have to listen to it a few times to really be like, oh yes, I enjoy this album. But that wasn't the case, especially with the singles that we got, 2010, Tabula Rasa, and Titanic. All three of those singles were just dope, and they were unique because, again, like they sounded different from his more recent works. So Earl's definitely doing something different, and I feel like, again, I mean, Earl is one of those guys that you have to listen to a bunch of times to fully understand what he's saying, but you don't, like with this album, I didn't have to listen to it a bunch of times to enjoy it, if that makes sense. But I don't know if that's due to the production, due to Earl's, I guess, slight change in subject matter, but it was enjoyable. It's definitely a quick listen, too. I mean, it's 24 minutes with 10 tracks, which, to be fair, is pretty typical of Earl. I mean, but he's just giving it to us straight, no frills, like he says on Titanic. My favorite tracks on this album are 2010, Tabula Rasa, Titanic, and Sick and Division, which, I mean, now that I remember, like, I usually do top 5 songs, and that's half the album, so do with that what you will. But that's all I have for this review. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this album and what your favorite tracks are. Also, let me know if I've just read too deep into some of these themes, or if I'm kind of on the right track. Earl's one of those guys that I feel like he runs with a concept and tries to keep it going, but doesn't beat you over the head with it. So let me know how I did. But also like and subscribe if you want to see more reviews and content like this. Thank you for watching, and please stay safe out there.